At her own engagement party, Vivienne Cross pulled the black maid Alina Marsh into the center of the room in front of 40 guests. She waved $7,000 in the air and laughed, saying someone like Alina probably knew how to dance for money anyway. Phones rose. Laughter spread, but the moment the music began, the entire room fell silent. And just as Alina finished her final move, the billionaire walked through the front door, and no one knew yet whose side he would take. If stories like this keep you hooked until the very last word, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this channel brings you a new one just like it every single week. The Wolf estate sat on 11 acres outside the city, the kind of property that appeared in magazines more often than it appeared in casual conversation. Damon Wolf had built his fortune from nothing, starting a logistics company in his mother's garage before turning it into something that made his name recognizable in rooms full of strangers. He traveled constantly chasing deals across 3 continents, and the house had long since become a place he visited rather than a place he lived. In his absence, it was his fiancée Vivienne Cross who decided how the household ran, who was hired and who was watched most closely. She had built her public image with the same discipline other people used to build careers, and she rarely let anyone see past it. Long before he became a name, people recognized Damon had spent his weekends volunteering at a small community arts center 2 towns over, the kind of place that survived on donated pianos and secondhand ballet bears. He helped fix the lighting, repaired the sound system when it broke, and sat in on evening classes more often than anyone realized, watching students long after most of the staff had gone home for the night. He never talked about that chapter of his life publicly, and most of the people who worked for him now had no idea it existed. It was there that he first learned, before money changed the shape of his world, that discipline and talent rarely announced themselves through wealth or connections. Some of the most gifted people he had ever watched move across a floor were also the ones nobody outside those walls ever thought to notice. Alina Marsh had worked in the Wolf House for almost 2 years, cleaning, organizing, and quietly managing the small tasks that kept a home of that size from slipping into chaos. She was in her late 20s, careful with her words, and steady in a way that made her easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Nothing about her daily life suggested that she had once spent years training in ballet and contemporary dance, chasing a career that had felt within reach until it wasn't. Financial pressure at home, family responsibilities, and a series of doors that kept closing had eventually pulled her away from the stage. She had folded that version of herself into something private, something she carried quietly without needing anyone else to see it. She was not ashamed of the work she did now. She simply did not want her past turned into a spectacle, something people could pick up and examine like a curiosity whenever they got bored of their own lives. Vivienne Cross was good at being watched. She was beautiful, well-spoken, and quick to remind people at dinner parties that she believed in treating everyone equally, no matter where they came from. But there was a version of her that only surfaced in smaller moments most guests never witnessed. She mispronounced Alina's name on purpose more than once. She inspected her work more closely than she inspected anyone else's. She offered comments dressed up as compliments, expressing surprise whenever Alina mentioned a book she had read or recognized a piece of music, as though intelligence were a novelty rather than simply who Alina was. What most people didn't know, and what Vivienne worked hard to keep buried, was that her own family had spent years just barely holding on to appearances before her mother remarried into money. She remembered thin winters and second-hand dresses altered to look new, and she had spent so long trying to erase that history that she had built an entire identity around never being mistaken for someone who came from nothing. Marrying Damon was not only about love, it was about permanence, about finally standing somewhere she could not be pushed out of again. And somewhere underneath that fear was a need to see other people, especially people she considered beneath her, stay exactly in their place, because if they didn't, her own climb suddenly felt less secure. Alina's composure unsettled her more than she ever admitted out loud. She wanted to see Alina crack, to lose her temper or her patience in front of witnesses, because that would confirm everything Vivienne quietly believed about people like her. Alina never gave her that satisfaction, and the unspoken tension between them had been building for 2 years without ever breaking into the open. The engagement party had been Vivienne's idea from the beginning, and she treated it less like a celebration and more like a performance she was directing. 40 guests filled the main hall that evening, a mix of business partners, socialite friends, and a handful of people whose entire careers were built on posting curated fragments of their lives online. Waitstaff moved quietly between them, refilling glasses and clearing plates, and Alina was among them, doing her best to stay in the background of a night that had nothing to do with her. But Vivienne kept finding small ways to point at her, asking her to fetch things in front of guests when someone closer could have done it, narrating her efficiency the way someone might narrate a nature documentary. Alina absorbed each comment, without reaction, filing it away the same way she filed away most things in that house. By the time the champagne had been flowing for a few hours, Vivienne decided she wanted a game. She stood in the center of the room, tapped her glass for attention, and announced that she had $7,000 in cash upstairs, and that she would give it to anyone brave enough to dance for the entire party. The room laughed, assuming she meant one of her socialite friends, someone who would perform a silly routine purely for entertainment. Her eyes did not land on any of her friends. They landed on Alina. "Our girl here," Vivienne said, gesturing toward her the way someone might introduce a pet trick, "probably knows how to move better than any of us. I'm sure dancing for money isn't exactly new to her." The comment folded two insults into a single sentence, dismissing Alina's profession while leaning on an old and ugly assumption about what kind of women dance for money and why. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the cruelty underneath the joke, but no one wanted to be the one who called it out during someone else's celebration. A handful of phones had already come out, angled toward Alina, waiting for something they could post before the night was over. Alina declined as politely as she could, saying she was there to work, not perform. Vivienne pushed further, suggesting Alina was probably too afraid to try and that she should feel grateful someone was offering her a chance to earn more in one dance than she made in a week of scrubbing floors. Something shifted in Alina as she stood there holding an empty serving tray, listening to 40 people wait to see what she would do next. She thought about 2 years of small corrections and quiet condescension, and about how she had convinced herself that staying quiet was the same thing as staying strong. But quiet had never actually stopped Vivienne. It had only ever fed her, giving her more room to push further the next time. Standing there under the weight of that realization, Alina understood this was never really about $7,000. It was about whether she would keep shrinking herself so someone else could feel bigger by comparison. She set the tray down on the nearest table. The sound of porcelain settling against wood was small, but it was enough to make a few guests turn toward her, sensing something had changed. "Fine," Alina said, her voice level and unhurried. "I'll dance. But not for your money." Vivienne blinked, caught off guard by the calm in her voice, though she recovered quickly and smiled wider already, assuming this would end in humiliation for someone else. She gestured toward the open space in the center of the room with a theatrical sweep of her arm. Alina walked forward without hurrying, without looking at the phones raised around her, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her hands shake. She was not stepping forward to prove she deserved respect. She was stepping forward because she was finished making herself smaller so other people could feel comfortable. The chatter in the room quieted as she reached the center, her back straight, her hands loose at her sides, waiting for whatever music Vivienne had chosen. Vivienne, still holding the stack of bills like a prop, nodded toward the sound system, confident that in a few minutes she would finally have the reaction she had been chasing for 2 years. The music began with a single sustained note, something classical, and layered, the kind of piece most people in that room had heard in passing but never truly listened to. Vivienne had chosen it deliberately, certain that a maid from a modest background would have no idea what to do with something so refined. For the first few seconds, Alina did not move. She stood in the center of the room in her plain uniform, surrounded by designer gowns and jewelry worth more than her annual salary, and the stillness stretched just long enough for a ripple of quiet laughter to pass through the crowd. Vivienne's smile widened, convinced the silence meant exactly what she wanted it to mean. But Alina was not frozen. She was listening, letting the first few bars settle into her chest, searching for a version of herself she had not allowed to exist in a very long time. Somewhere behind her eyes, a memory surfaced without warning: the smell of resin on a studio floor, the particular ache in her calves after a long rehearsal, a version of her life she thought she had closed the door on for good. When she finally moved, the change in her was immediate and impossible to miss. Her shoulders opened, her spine lengthened, and her eyes fixed on some point beyond the room, the way dancers learn to do when they need to disappear into the movement instead of the audience. She began with something close to classical ballet, precise and controlled, each line of her body deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with luck or improvisation. It was clear, even to people who knew nothing about dance, that they were watching someone who had trained for years, not someone stumbling through a dare. The laughter in the room faded within seconds. Guests who had raised their phones expecting to capture a stumble, instead, found themselves recording something they could not look away from. Alina moved from the formal shapes of ballet into something looser and more emotional, a contemporary style that seemed to carry an entire history inside it. Each gesture landed like a sentence in a story only she fully understood. It was not decoration. It was closer to an argument, one built entirely out of movement about every time she had been underestimated and every time she had said nothing at all in response. Vivian's expression began to shift as she watched her plan unravel in real time. She had wanted Alina exposed and small in front of everyone who mattered to her socially, and instead the room was leaning forward transfixed by a woman she had spent 2 years dismissing as beneath her notice. The power in the room was moving quietly but unmistakably away from the woman holding the money and toward the woman who had never asked for it in the first place. When the final note faded, nobody laughed. For a moment, nobody did anything at all, and then one guest began to clap, followed quickly by another until the sound filled the entire hall. Alina stood in the center of it without reaching for the cash still sitting nearby. She looked directly at Vivian instead, and the message in that look needed no words. Whatever this had been about, it had never been something $7,000 could settle. It was at that exact moment that the front door opened. Damon Wolfe stepped into his own home 2 days earlier than expected, carrying a single travel bag and the tired smile of a man looking forward to surprising someone he loved. He had imagined Vivian's reaction when she saw him walk in unannounced during her own party. What he found instead was a room full of raised phones, his fiancée standing beside a visible stack of bills, and one of his household staff standing in the center of everyone's attention, clearly having just finished something the entire room was still reacting to. He had no context for any of it, and for a few seconds, he simply tried to read the room the way he read unfamiliar negotiations. Vivian recovered first. She crossed the floor toward him with practiced ease, already shaping the story before he could ask a single question. "You will not believe what just happened," she said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, framing it as though she were letting him in on something amusing. She explained that Alina had taken it upon herself to perform in front of everyone accepting money, to turn the party into her own personal stage. She added almost as an afterthought that it was a strange thing for staff to do, and that perhaps Alina had taken advantage of an offer that was never meant to be taken so literally. The guests who had not witnessed the earlier exchange, the comments about dancing for money, and the pressure that had actually forced Alina into the center of the room had no reason to question the story. A few of them nodded along, already halfway convinced they had watched an employee overstep in front of her employer's future husband. Alina understood immediately what was happening. She knew how quickly a story could be rewritten when the person telling it held more power than the person it was being told about, and she understood that in a room eager to keep the evening pleasant, her side of it might never be heard at all. Damon studied Alina for a long moment, something tugging at the edge of his memory. It was not simply that she looked familiar. It was the particular way she stood, feet grounded, spine long, shoulders set in a posture he had watched hundreds of times from a folding chair at the back of a rehearsal room years ago, back when he still had time to sit through an entire evening class before locking up the building himself. "Alina Marsh," he said quietly, almost to himself before saying it again with more certainty. "You trained at the Community Arts Center on 5th Street. I used to help close up some nights. You were always the last one still working through your combinations after everyone else had already gone home." The room did not fully understand what he meant, but Alina did. For a moment something loosened in her expression, some old and complicated ache surfacing at being recognized for exactly the part of herself she had spent years keeping hidden. She had not expected anyone in this house, least of all Damon, to remember that version of her at all. Vivian's composure cracked slightly at the edges, unsettled by a connection she had not accounted for and could not immediately control. She recovered quickly, insisting that whatever history existed between them had nothing to do with what had just happened, and repeating her demand that Damon address the situation properly as the owner of the house and the man whose name was on every document that mattered. She told him in front of everyone that Alina needed to be let go immediately, that she had embarrassed the family and overstepped in a way that could not be ignored. Alina did not wait for Damon to respond. She reached up and untied her apron, folding it carefully before setting it down on the same table where the serving tray still sat. She told Damon calmly and without pleading that she would leave on her own. She was not asking him to defend her, and she was not asking to keep her job. The only thing she asked was that whatever story circulated about tonight not be a false one. For a moment it seemed as though she might simply walk out with nothing, resolved, her income gone, her reputation reduced to whatever version Vivian chose to repeat to people with far more influence than she had. Before she reached the door, a woman near the back of the hall raised her voice, asking everyone to wait. She explained a little nervously that her phone had captured the entire exchange from the very beginning, not just the dance, But everything leading up to it, including Vivienne's original comments and the repeated pressure that followed, Alina's first refusal, she played it for the room. The clip moved through the crowd, phone passed from hand to hand, and the mood shifted with each viewing. There was no way to argue with the sequence of events once people heard it in Vivienne's own voice. Damon watched the footage in silence, his expression hardening with each passing second, and when it ended, the room had gone completely quiet, waiting to see what he would do with what he now knew. Damon lowered the phone after the video ended, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. The silence in the room felt heavier than any noise could have. 40 guests standing frozen, waiting to see which direction he would turn. Vivienne stepped closer to him, already rebuilding her explanation, insisting the clip only showed a small part of the evening, and that people were reading cruelty into something that had only ever been a joke between friends. It was a party game, she said, her voice tightening despite her attempt to sound light. People say things at parties. Nobody meant any of it seriously. Damon turned to face her fully, and something in his posture had changed since he first walked through the door. He told her plainly that he had just watched Alina refuse twice, watched Vivienne push past both refusals, and watched an entire room stand by while one woman decided that another woman's dignity was hers to use for entertainment. Vivienne's expression shifted from defensive to something sharper, something she had clearly been holding beneath the surface for longer than tonight. She raised her voice, no longer concerned with how it sounded to the guests, still watching, telling him that Alina was staff and nothing more, and that he was choosing someone who worked in his house over the woman who was supposed to become his wife. For a moment, something else slipped through in her voice, something underneath the anger that sounded almost like fear. She said she had spent her entire life fighting to be taken seriously in rooms exactly like this one, that she had not been born into the comfort most of these guests assumed she had always had. She said she was not going to let anyone, especially someone who cleaned floors for a living, make her feel unstable in the one place she had finally built for herself. The admission landed strangely in the room, revealing something Vivienne had clearly never intended to say aloud. It did not excuse what she had done to Alina. It only made the choice in front of Damon feel less like a misunderstanding and more like a pattern he could no longer unsee now that he had noticed it. "This isn't about one moment," he said quietly. "It's about how you see people who don't have as much power as you do. I don't think tonight is the first time. I think it's just the first time someone caught it on camera." Vivienne opened her mouth to argue again, but nothing she said seemed to land the way it once might have. The guests around her had grown quiet in a different way, now no longer entertained by the spectacle, but visibly uncomfortable with what they had just watched unfold. Damon turned away from her and walked toward Alina, who was still standing near the table where she had left her folded apron. He apologized to her directly, telling her he had no idea what she had endured in his own home, and that not knowing did not excuse it. He said the apology only mattered if it changed something, and he understood if she had no reason yet to believe him. Alina studied him for a moment, before answering, her voice steady despite everything that had just happened. She told him she appreciated the words, but that she had learned a long time ago not to measure sincerity by what someone said in the middle of a crisis. What mattered, she said, was what happened after the room emptied out and the cameras stopped recording. Damon nodded, accepting the weight of that answer without trying to soften it. He turned back to Vivienne and told her in front of everyone who remained that the engagement was over. He said it without theater, without raising his voice, simply stating a decision that had already been made the moment the footage played through to the end. He added that this had nothing to do with how well Alina had danced and everything to do with the fact that no one in his house should have ever been treated the way she had been treated that night, talented or not. Vivienne stood there for a moment, the reality of the evening finally settling into something she could not talk her way around. She left without another word, her heels echoing against the marble floor, until the front door closed behind her. The party did not resume in any normal sense after that. Guests began leaving quietly, some offering awkward apologies to Alina on their way out, others simply avoiding eye contact, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. In the days that followed, Damon reached out to offer Alina her position back, telling her that nothing about her job needed to change if she did not want it to. She declined, not out of anger, but because something in her had shifted the night she stepped into the center of that room. She told him she wanted to try dancing again, seriously this time, not as an act of defiance, but because it was the one thing she had never stopped missing, no matter how many years had passed since she last stood in a real studio. Damon offered to help her find a training program, careful to frame it as an open door rather than a debt she now owed him. Alina accepted the introduction not because she felt obligated to him, but because it was quite simply what she wanted for herself. Within weeks, the full video from that night had made its way online, and unlike the fragments Vivienne once tried to control, this version included everything: the mockery, the pressure, and the moment Alina had stood her ground before ever stepping onto the floor. Public reaction turned quickly against Vivienne, and several of the guests who had once laughed along or filmed in silence found themselves publicly reflecting on their own role in staying quiet that night. Alina paid little attention to any of it. She was too busy returning to a studio for the first time in years, adjusting to muscles that remembered more than her mind expected them to. The road ahead of her was not simple, and she was not chasing overnight recognition. For the first time in a long while, though, the direction of her life belonged entirely to her, shaped by her own choices instead of someone else's assumptions. Several months later, Alina stood backstage at a small theater waiting for her cue in a showcase built specifically for performers returning to the stage after years away from it. Her name was listed simply on the program, no mention of the party, no mention of the video that had circulated so widely earlier that year. Damon sat somewhere in the middle of the audience that evening, having asked for a regular ticket instead of a reserved seat near the front. He did not want to be seen since 2012. He did not want to be seen as the reason for her return, because he understood clearly, now, that he had only opened a door that had always belonged to her to walk through. When the music began, Alina moved without the noise of 40 phones, or the weight of anyone's expectations pressing down on her. The audience watching her that night had no idea about the party, the mockery, or the $7,000 once used to try to measure her worth. They only saw a woman completely present in her own body, dancing because she wanted to, not because anyone had demanded it of her. When the final note faded and the applause rose around her, it did not carry the strange, uneasy energy of that earlier night. It was simple recognition offered freely, without pity or spectacle behind it. The money that had once been placed beside her like a price tag no longer meant anything at all, reduced to a detail from a night that had tried and failed to define her. In the end, the story was never really about a dance or a dare. It was about what happens when someone decides they are done shrinking themselves for the comfort of people who never valued them in the first place, and how the truth, once it finally surfaces, has a way of settling exactly where it belongs. If this story reminded you that dignity is never something someone else gets to price, and that the quietest people in the room are often the ones carrying the most strength, let that sit with you for a moment. And if you'd like more stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.